Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I know people are still filing in at the top of the hour, but we only have 30 minutes, so I want to make sure that we get started and use the time we have in the best way possible. My name is Kyler Blodgett. I'm at PeopleForBikes as a state and local policy analyst, and I'm thrilled that you all are here for this webinar. Thank you for joining us for Trade and Tariff Outlook, how these changes affect your business. Before we jump into the content, I'd like to give a big thank you to our PeopleForBikes Coalition members and any that are here on the call today. Your support helps us work on our collective mission to get more people riding bikes more often. If you're not already a member, please drop a message in the chat, and I myself, one of my team members, would love to follow up with you with a list of the extensive benefits that our membership has to offer. With that, I'd like to kick off to our experts on the webinar today by introducing our panelists. Today, I'm thrilled to have two of my colleagues, Alex Logeman, our policy counsel here at PeopleForBikes, as well as Noah Banayan, our director of federal affairs. Alex and Noah, so glad that you both are here. We'll be discussing about 20 minutes of content and then have hopefully 10 minutes or so left for Q&A at the end. So drop those questions in the chat using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First, we'll start by discussing Section 301 tariffs and recent opportunities for relief. We'll look ahead on GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, and MTB, the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill, as well as other trade programs. We'll have a quick note on how everyone on this call can take action, and then jump into that 10 minutes of Q&A that I said. And with that, and no further ado, I'd love to pass it to Alex to get us started. And Alex and Noah, just nudge me if you want to go into the next slide. And here we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Kyler. I'm Alex Logeman. I'm policy counsel at PeopleForBikes. See a lot of familiar names on the attendee list today. Thank you for showing up. I see a lot of new folks. Hope we can be informative to answer all of your questions that you have related to what's going on in the trade and tariff space today. I've been working on this issue in a pretty dedicated way since the Section 301 tariffs were implemented almost 3 years ago now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But, you know, obviously it became a very significant issue for us to pay attention to with this curveball sort of thrown at us in the last administration. Noah, you want to do a quick introduction before we dive into the substance?
Sure. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Kyler. I'm glad to be with you all today. I'm Noah Banayan, Director of Federal Affairs for PeopleForBikes, based in Washington, D.C. And Alex, go right ahead.
Thanks, Noah. So, you know, I think what's top of mind for a lot of companies is certainly the Section 301 tariffs. I want to start out by just reiterating kind of where we're at today. The tariffs were first proposed and started going into effect in 2018. We've had a lot of ebbs and flows along the way, with exclusions being granted, rates being reduced on some products, rates going back up on some products, proposals to have certain list tariffs that never went into effect. So it's been a little bit of a roller coaster here, but where we are today, the bottom line is that the Section 301 tariffs are in effect for pretty much all China origin bicycle products. For items on list 1, 2, and 3, that tariff is 25% ad valorem. And for items on list 4A, it's 7.5%. That sort of settlement agreement that the US and China reached early on is still into effect, that pulled back the tariffs on list 4B and then reduced the tariff rate from 15% to 7.5% on list 4A. Just a quick note on some of the products that are covered and where they are on the list. E-bikes are on list 2, most bicycles are on list 3. Components are kind of split between the two lists on 3 and 4A. There's no real logic to how those are divided up. And then some accessories like lights and helmets are on list 4A. So for the most part, all of our core product categories are currently covered by the tariffs. Kyler, next slide. All right, so there's a few different things going on in this space where there could be opportunities for tariff relief for the entities that are being affected here. And the first thing I just want to touch base on briefly is the ongoing litigation that's been filed against the United States and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office regarding whether these tariffs are actually legal in the first place. A lawsuit was filed basically alleging that the U.S. Trade Representative, the president, had exceeded their authority in enacting these tariffs under the Trade Act of 1974. The crux of that argument being along the lines of that the Trade Act was never meant to allow tariffs of sort of this scale and this magnitude. And they've sort of exceeded their authority in having such a sweeping amount of products and things covered by the tariffs. The second set of issues mostly relates to the Administrative Procedure Act and basically whether, you know, proper notice and comment procedures were followed in this type of action. This is a huge lawsuit. There's more than 6,500 plaintiffs that are involved now. And it's sort of being treated like a class action in a sense in which we're going to have some test cases move forward that'll be tried by a 3-judge panel in the Court of International Trade. The last year has been sort of occupied with a lot of preliminary issues. One of the things that first came up was the government had maintained that the Court of International Trade actually didn't have the authority to provide refunds on a lot of liquidated entries, which would obviously have a big effect on how much people could recover from some of the tariffs that have been paid already. And that issue was at least largely resolved in October of 2021, where the government essentially acknowledged that tariffs, at least on most liquidated entries, should be recoverable by the plaintiffs in this case. And there was a lot of discussion about how difficult of a procedure that might be to manage the liquidated entries, but that issue seems to be at least mostly settled at this point. But there's a long way to go. The lawsuit's not been briefed on the merits yet, and it will take months or years to resolve. Next slide, Kyler. All right, exclusion reinstatement. This is a little more recent development. In October, the Trade Representative's Office finally released an announcement regarding a mechanism by which it would reconsider exclusions that had been previously granted. It had been a long time since the exclusion process had been open and available to companies importing products from China. The last set of exclusions had expired in December of 2020, and basically nothing had been available since that time. So this was certainly welcome news, but this particular process was relatively narrow in scope. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office had created a list of 549 previously issued exclusions. These were all the exclusions that had expired in December of 2020. If the exclusion had expired prior to that, it actually wasn't part of this process. But for us, this did include a lot of really important categories: all kids bikes and BMX bikes, basically all bikes with wheels smaller than 26 inches, e-bikes, some specific categories of adult bikes, carbon frames, one of our categories of helmets, some saddles and trailers. We did have a lot at stake here. I think what's really important to note here is how critical it is that we participate as an industry in each step of this process, because the reason we now have this opportunity to potentially get tariff relief again is because of all the work we did back in 2018, 2019, 2020. If we hadn't applied for exclusions back then, if we hadn't gotten them extended to December of 2020, none of this would be available right now. So these things continue to sort of build on each other, and we've managed to save the industry a lot of money through this exclusion process prior, and a lot of that work now is hopefully going to pay a second dividend if we receive some favorable outcomes. Next slide, Color. So this public comment period closed on December 1st, just about a week ago. We generated almost 100 comments in support of reinstating these various exclusions. There were no comments against that, so we certainly feel like we're in a really good position, and we had good participation in this process. We don't know how long it's going to take for USTR to conduct the review process for all these comments. It could take weeks, could take months. So now we're in a little bit of a holding pattern as the agency just goes through and considers what to do with the comments it's received and whether to reinstate these various exclusions, and also for how long. It's not known what the time period will be if these exclusions are reinstated. Next slide, Gar. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Noah to talk a little bit about what's going on with Section 301 in Congress, because it's obviously been an issue of great interest to many of our senators and representatives.
Right. I mean, there's industries in every congressional state, every district and state across the country that are joining the bike industry, and we are joining them and calling for, you know, immediate tariff relief and other progress on trade policy that we'll talk about in a few more slides. Most of the action on trade policy has been really centered in the Senate this year. And in June of 2021, the Senate passed the Endless Frontiers Act, which some of you may have followed. It's massive competitiveness with China, science-focused legislation that did include policies that would have been incredibly beneficial for the bike industry. And just because there isn't really any potential for the House to take this up before the end of the year. This congressional session does not actually end at the end of the year. It'll go through 2022. And so they could very likely take this policy up, this bill, into the House, into the new year. And there has been some discussion about adding it into larger packages. The specifics of the Endless Frontiers Act that are relevant for our purposes are that it would include a reinstatement of previously issued exclusions with some retroactive recovery, a requirement for a new process to review exclusion requests, so we could actually put our comments on the record with no more opportunity for that, and more detailed procedures regarding how exclusion requests would be reviewed and ruled upon. Many of you who have been working in this area for a while and filing your own exclusion requests and having questions about the filings and the responses that you may be getting from USTR, the rulings, know that there hasn't been a lot of transparency in how they come to these decisions. So this is really, really important so that the bike industry can be aware of, you know, why some helmets were excluded and some weren't on different lists, and you know, questions like that. I think looking ahead into 2022, inflation and supply chain are sort of the two biggest buzzwords and issues that are going to be taking shape and taking up the agenda, to the extent that there is a legislative agenda and it's not just election focused next year. And so that means that these types of policies around Section 301, tariffs, relating to USTR and the other programs that we'll be discussing have a really high potential for progress in Congress in 2022. The infrastructure bill has been signed into law. This reconciliation bill could potentially move before the end of the year. And so that sort of clears the way for policies like this on trade. We can go to the next slide, Kyler. Some of these other programs that I've sort of mentioned. The Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, holds a lot of potential for the bike industry, and many of the manufacturers in our membership and in the industry and on this call are probably familiar depending on where you import from. And if so, you'll know that the GSP did expire on December 31st of 2020. So we're coming up on nearly a year of expiration, and it requires a renewal for this program to go back into effect. This was included in the Endless Frontiers Act that the Senate passed in June of this year. And we do need congressional action to get that renewal of the program. It is very much expected that this program and another one that we'll get to, the miscellaneous tariff bill, will be renewed and likely packaged into whatever broader policy action takes place on trade policy. But again, that timeline, besides 2022 generally early, remains unclear. Next slide, please. The miscellaneous tariffs bill, the other MTV that we talk about in the bike industry, is designed to provide tariff relief on products that lack domestic manufacturing, which of course is really important for the bike industry. And again, just like GSP, this expired the end of 2020. We're coming up on a year of expiration. Important actions that happened this year is that the USITC, the International Trade Commission, completed a review process for the next miscellaneous tariffs bill. PeopleForBikes was engaged in that process, and we petitioned successfully to have 23 products recommended for all tariff relief. And ideally, the renewal legislation that Congress will put forward will take the report from the USITC into account, and we'll get to see those 23 products with tariff relief. And it's, as it states here, this program, once it is renewed, could potentially save the industry almost $20 million. Again, just on timing, this was included in the Endless Frontiers Act like GSP. It is expected to be included in whatever trade policy package moves in early-ish 2022. But again, a clear timeline remains not here. And we do have our full list of recommendations for the MTB on our website. That link will be included in the follow-up to this webinar. We can go to the next slide. Awesome. Alex, back to you.
Yeah, so shifting away from policy or our policy work per se, for a second, I want to talk about some other things that we are working on at People4Bikes. One of our member benefits for coalition members is a tariff guide that provides folks with information about how various bicycle products are classified. It addresses issues like origin, how origin of those products are determined. It talks about the status of the various programs and what the discounted rates are if you have products coming from GSP countries, things like that. We're finalizing some updates to the tariff guide now and plan to release it in January 2022. And as I mentioned, yeah, we'll have updates on a bunch of rulings that have been released by Customs and Border Protection in the last 18 months or so, changes to the tariff schedule, and some classification information for new products that previously haven't been part of the guide. So if you remember, keep your eyes open for that new updated tariff guide as we get into the new year. And Noah, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about what we're thinking about for 2022.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I hope that many of you here listening are familiar with this report that you see on the screen that Alex and I and some of our members in the Legal, Legislative, and Safety Subcommittee put together and published at the end of 2020. So December 2020, we released this report, and it's basically an agenda for this administration and this Congress that we would like to see policies in the report put forward regarding trade and how it affects the bike industry. It also goes into some of the history of trade policy affecting the bicycle industry and why we are in the situation we're in now. So it is a bit dense. I think it's like 11 to 13 pages, but some really great holiday reading, I would hope, if you haven't dug into it yet. But all of that is to say, you know, while we have made progress on a lot of the agenda items that we put in this report for 2021, there's a lot that remains on the agenda for Congress to address. So because, like I said, this congressional session it's two, you know, Congress goes for 2 years every session. This is still the 117th Congress. So that will continue into 2022. And so our policy priorities as listed in this report remain in large part everything we've outlined, from tariff relief, GSP and MTB renewal, and several more that we didn't even get into today, still very much remain a priority for People4Bikes going into 2022. And of course, it wouldn't be a People4Bikes webinar if we're not asking you to do something at the end. You can help us, please help you. So what we're asking folks to do today, very specifically, is help spread the word in Congress. So with your elected representatives in the House specifically, about a letter, we call them Dear Colleague letters in DC, that's being circulated from a few members of Congress. It's Congressman Kind, LaHood, Congresswoman Walorski, and apologies, I'm forgetting the last one. The letter is circulating to other members of Congress. The ask is specific that a broader exclusion process be met at USTR, broader than the one that we recently commented on, and that retroactivity on products that were previously excluded and may be excluded in the near future be granted earlier than October 12th so that our members can get a bit more savings on those tariffed products. We will share the letter in the follow-up to this email, but the ask again is really simple. I hope it's making a phone call to your House member and asking them to sign this letter and you'll be able to, you can email that office as well. We are always more than happy to help make connections between bike companies and your federally elected officials. So if you are confused about that or haven't reached out to your House office before, please email me. You will have my email address if you don't already by the end of this webinar, and we would be more than happy to help you help us. So thank you.
Noah and Alex, thank you so much for this morning. There are no questions in the Q&A so far, which either means that you covered this topic so coherently that no one has any questions, or that people could maybe use a minute to process. So please, if you're sitting on questions, share them in the Q&A, share them in the chat for Alex and Noah to consider in our final 10 minutes together.
I do see one in the chat here, Kyler, that I'm happy to get into. It's a question about which products are subject to the 301 tariffs. There's not a list per se of only bicycle products in which corresponding tariff rate applies to them. But again, at a high level, all e-bikes are subject to the 25% tariff as a list 2 item. All complete bikes are subject to the 25% tariff as a list 3 item. Most components are also on list 3 and subject to the 25% tariff. There are a few component categories on list 4A, which are subject to the 7.5% tariff. That's things like shifters, derailleurs, and then that miscellaneous category of the tariff schedule where everything goes that's a bike product that doesn't have a specific line item. So that actually includes kind of a lot of things. And then helmets and lights are also on list 4A at 7.5%. The second part of this question is about which of those tariffs are being challenged in the courts or in this lawsuit. The way the lawsuit is framed right now, it's really challenging the tariffs as a whole. Essentially the same procedures were followed by the U.S. Trade Representative at each step of implementing these tariffs. So it's not really about one particular list or one particular set of items. It's really about challenging the entire process and authority over these tariffs as a whole. So I would expect that unless this evolves as the case goes on, if the plaintiffs were going to be successful in this lawsuit, it's going to jeopardize all of the tariffs on all of the products, including ones that are not bicycle products. It's not going to be a narrow subset of items that the tariffs would be thrown out on.
Thanks, Alex. Looking at the Q&A, I think there's another question for you. Can only one of the 6,500 plaintiffs in the lawsuit apply for reimbursement of tariffs paid under 301? Are you able to answer that?
So, I mean, I think this is an important question for people to think about. If you haven't joined that lawsuit, but you have a lot of potential money at stake on the outcome, you may want to consider speaking with your legal counsel to see if you can still join that lawsuit and potentially participate. Because if you're not part of the lawsuit, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to recover any of the tariffs if the lawsuit is ultimately successful. Part of the reason this preliminary issue of liquidated entries was important was because each of the plaintiffs in this case are wondering, what is my recovery going to be if we're ultimately successful on these claims? Is it just going to be looking forward to future tariffs I could avoid, or am I going to be able to go back in time and be reimbursed for things that I've already paid in? And the answer at this time appears to be you'll be able to get reimbursed for quite a bit, even on liquidated entries. So in theory, at least, reimbursement should be a potential outcome for all of the plaintiffs that are now part of the lawsuit. But if you're not part of the lawsuit, that's very unlikely to be something that's on the table for you.
Thanks, Alex. I think this last one we can probably answer together. Has there been any indication that some countries may be dropped from the generalized system of preferences? I think besides what has been public about Cambodia expiring and India being removed, that was in 2019, I believe. I have not seen any very strong indications about other countries for now. Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I think it's important here to probably distinguish between the legislation that would renew GSP and other actions that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office could take under any enabling legislation. So the way the legislation has been set up, it's not as if Congress is going to revoke any country's GSP status through that legislation, but they are going to put additional review criteria in place for all GSP beneficiary countries to have reviewed on a regular basis by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. So there are already some in place today, but there would be much greater emphasis, I think, on having one, regular reviews by USTR on a shorter timeline. So, once every 2 to 5 years, and then also including specific criteria that USTR needs to address in its reports around environmental issues and human rights issues. So what that means going forward, certainly if USTR has concerns about activities in any of those countries, it could jeopardize their GSP status. But we're not anticipating now that as a result of the legislation, any countries will be sort of thrown in or thrown out. It'll be a separate inquiry by USTR based on their statutory criteria that they're given to report on regularly.
Thanks again, Alex. We have another question here that I can take a first stab at. With so many manufacturers of parts now seeking to shift production to countries not included under the tariff penalties, is there an incentive to promote this transition as well as potential domestic production? So while an incentive from the federal government would be, great to support that goal of theirs to promote domestic production, I think the idea behind the policy, I'm not saying that we support this in any way, is that the incentive is not being tariffed. So what, the bike industry sort of stands in an unfortunate conflict where everything that this administration wants for carbon emissions, public health, economic growth, lowering, keeping people moving, active, healthy, and communities connected, like bikes serve all of those goals of this administration, very specifically the emissions reductions goal from a transportation perspective. But unfortunately, we aren't seeing any incentives from the trade policy sphere to promote that. So this is an ongoing discussion that we're having with folks in Washington, D.C., with the administration and in Congress. We're seeing incentives in other forms, of course, through things like this tax credit for e-bikes that's currently being negotiated, a commuter benefit for biking to work. But for actual production and manufacturing, there really hasn't been a lot of opportunity to insert potential incentives for the bike industry and others, despite this growing emphasis from the Biden administration on, made in the U.S. products, union jobs, everything like that. So it's just this unfortunate conflict that still stands, but I think the government answer would be the incentive is to not be tariffed.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, Noah, that because we just went through some of these issues in filing the comments for reinstatement of the exclusions. And when you break down the tariff data, I think when you look at 2018, 2019, and 2020, in 2020, it started looking like production for a lot of items might be drifting away from China in a somewhat noteworthy way. But then when you look at 2021, that does not appear to be the case anymore. China is very dominant in several of the key categories on things like children's bikes and other things where they're the main source. So my takeaway from talking to suppliers is that it's been really hard to find capacity outside of China under the very heavy demand constraints we have and a lot of the other supply chain issues. And that when we look at the 2021 data instead of the 2020 data, it's kind of bearing that out. I think the 2020 data was just skewed by a lack of imports in general due to the pandemic and COVID. And so I think I know there's a lot of interest in both diversifying the supply chain to third countries outside of China and to doing things domestically. Implementing it, I just think, is proving hard.
Absolutely. So we are, I think, just about time. I'll just very quickly answer this one question. There's a bill that was passed in the Senate. There's some conversation about introducing it in the House, but we haven't even seen an introduction so far. So that's the Endless Frontiers Act that I mentioned. And then this last question, where can I find the products that will be included in the miscellaneous tariffs bill? If you go in the chat, Alex just kindly put it in there.
Yep, if you click on that link in the chat, you'll see a little spreadsheet that gives you a list of all the bike-related petitions. They were almost all approved with the exception of 2 items. And it'll give you what the current rate is and what the proposed rate reduction is, and then what the estimated savings from the U.S. International Trade Commission's projected to be.
Great. Noah and Alex, thank you so much. I have your emails on the screen in case any of our guests want to follow up with you with questions afterwards. Everyone, in case you want to go back and take notes again or miss something, this webinar was recorded and will be posted on our People for Bikes website shortly, so you can find all our content information and this webinar content there. Thank you so much for taking your time with us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Noah and Alex, thank you also.